Hey everyone, I'm Nic Raboy from MongoDB. In this tutorial, we're going to see how to work with Microsoft Azure Functions, and we're going to see how to use them to interact with MongoDB. So Microsoft Azure Functions are the serverless offering that Microsoft offers for application development. We're going to see how to use that to connect to MongoDB efficiently and effectively, as well as interact with the data that might exist in your MongoDB database. Now, a few things when it comes to this particular tutorial. I'm anticipating that you already have a Microsoft Azure account established, and I'm also anticipating that you already have a MongoDB Atlas account established. Now, you'll need at least the free tier cluster for MongoDB, so the M0 sized shared cluster. But if you have something better, that works as well. But everything that we see in this particular tutorial, it can be done in the free tier. Now, up on my screen, you'll notice that I do have MongoDB Atlas loaded. This is the MongoDB Atlas dashboard. I already do have my cluster deployed. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Browse Collections. And you'll notice that I have a few sample sets loaded already for this particular cluster. We're going to be working with the sample mflix database, part of the sample set. It really doesn't matter which database or which collection or which documents that you're working with, because the example itself isn't going to go into too much depth around actually working with massive amounts of data. We're just going to be working with a few documents. It doesn't really matter where those documents exist in MongoDB. Anything is perfectly fine for us. Now, if I go to my Microsoft Azure dashboard, you'll notice that I really have no apps created. We're going to be doing that from scratch. We're going to be using a few command line utilities, although a lot of what we accomplish here today can be done with a point and click kind of way to develop this particular serverless function. But do note that I'm going to be doing everything from the command line or my local editor, which in my case is going to be Visual Studio Code. All right, so let's get down to business. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my command line, and we're going to start creating a new Microsoft Azure project and all of the fixins that goes into it as far as creating our serverless application. And then we're going to move into the development side of things, which we're going to be focusing on JavaScript and Node.js, and we're going to connect the two together. So let's start by spinning up a new group within Microsoft Azure. So we're going to say Azure, so AZ, this is with the Azure command line utility. So the expectation is that you have it installed. And we're going to say group, we're going to say create, we're going to give it a name. So let's go ahead and say maybe my MongoDB app. Doesn't really matter. As long as you're consistent throughout your application. We're going to say location, and we're going to give it a region. So we're going to say East US is going to be our region, and we're going to hit enter. Now, assuming that it succeeded, we can move on to the next step, which would be creating a storage account for this particular function. And once again, we're going to be using the Azure command line utility. So with that installed and configured, we're going to say Azure, so AZ, storage. We're going to say account, create. We're going to give it a name. This name is for your storage location, not your group, but we will be referencing the group in just a second. So for the name, I'm going to say my MongoDB storage maybe. And I'm also going to give it a location. Now, it's a good idea to actually use the same location as your group. Likewise with the other stuff as well, because you want the best possible latency for your application. So it makes sense to include everything in the same region. But you can always set it up to meet your needs as well. So I'm going to say East US. And finally, I'm going to reference the group that I had just created. So I'm going to say resource group, and I called it my MongoDB app. I'm going to hit enter. All right, so we're almost done with the process. Let's continue down the line of creating all of our setup parts. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to say AZ for Azure. We're going to say function app, and we're going to say create. We're going to define the resource group that we had created at the beginning, which would be my MongoDB app. We're going to define a consumption plan location. So I'm going to say consumption plan location, and I'm going to say East US. I'm going to define what kind of runtime I wish to use, and in this case, like I mentioned, we're going to be using Node, so I'm going to say runtime Node, but you can always look at the other runtimes that make sense for you, like C# and whatnot. I'm going to define the function's version. So in this case, I'm going to be using version 4. I'm going to give it an app name, so the function app name. So I'm going to say my MongoDB function maybe. maybe my MongoDB function app. My naming convention is pretty poor in this particular example, but you would use stuff that actually makes sense for your organizational needs. But my MongoDB function app, and I'm going to define the storage account. If I scroll up, I already forgot what my storage account was. My storage account name was my MongoDB storage. And then I'm going to hit enter. All right, so it looks like it created successfully. So just to reiterate what we did a lot of command line right here with the Azure CLI, but we created a group. We gave it a US East region. We created a storage account for our function, which once again had a US East region, but it had a different name from our actual group. And then we defined the actual function app, which we provided that same group, that same storage location or same storage name. And we defined what runtime we plan to use, which was Node, as well as the version. So if we go back into the Azure cloud here and refresh, we should be able to go into Functions app and see my MongoDB function app is there. If I go back home, I can go to storage accounts, and you'll notice that I also do have a my MongoDB storage. So everything seems to have worked correctly. So this is where we can actually start working with our local project. So the local project is actually going to be using the Azure Functions core tools. So this is another CLI application. So just to be clear, we're going to be working with two different CLI applications. The Azure CLI for actually deploying and working with stuff in the cloud, and then the Functions core tools, which is going to be for actually developing our function, which we're going to be able to test locally as well as push remotely as well. So going back into the CLI, we're going to run some commands. So we're going to say function init, and I'm going to call this one Azure example. And notice that I am on my desktop. It doesn't really matter where you create it. Just make sure you know where you're creating it to. So I'm going to select 3 for Node. I'm going to select 1 for JavaScript, and it went ahead and created it for me. So the next thing that I can do is I can actually load this project. So I'm going to navigate into it. I'm going to say Azure example, and I'm going to open it up in my editor. All right, so you'll notice that I do have my Visual Studio Code open. It has the project that was just created. There's not much going on yet, but there will be. So I'm going to open up my inline terminal. I could very easily use the previous terminal that I had open just a moment ago, but I'm going to switch over to this so that way it's all integrated into the kind of developer workflow. And I'm going to run some more commands. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new function. So I have a functions app. This is what I have right now is a functions app called Azure example. I'm going to create a function within this app. It's once again using the CLI. So I'm going to say function, and I'm going to say new. I'm going to say name. Let's go ahead and name that function. I'm going to say get movies, and I'm going to use a particular template. So I'm going to say template, and I'm going to say HTTP trigger. So this is a template that this particular CLI tool offers, and I'm going to hit enter. So you'll notice that it did some stuff. For one, it created a get movies directory. That directory has a few files in it. We're going to be doing all of our work inside of the index.js file. And you can see that it gave us some rough boilerplate when it comes to creating a function. We're going to swap a lot of it out in just a moment. But since we know that we're going to be using MongoDB for this particular example, I'm going to clear my terminal, and I'm going to install a dependency. I'm going to say npm install MongoDB. So this is the MongoDB Node.js driver, which is going to work both locally as well as remotely. Now, it installed it for the entire project, not just that particular function. So if I were to create more functions, I'd still be able to use the driver. What I want to do is start making modifications to the index.js file. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to import that particular driver. So I'm going to say constant Mongo client, and I'm going to say equals require, and I'm going to say MongoDB. I am also going to kind of initialize that client with a particular MongoDB URI string. So what I can say is I can say constant, I can say Mongo client equals new Mongo client, and this is where I would provide that URI string. Now, what does that URI string look like? Well, let's go ahead and open up our web browser once more. I'm going to go back into MongoDB. I am going to click, I'm going to go home here. I'm going to click on Atlas. I'm going to click on connect. I'm going to say connect my application. I'm going to choose Node.js. I'm going to choose the latest version. And I'm going to copy this URI string. So I'm going to copy it. I'm going to go back into Visual Studio Code. For now, I'm going to paste it in right there. And I say for now because we're going to move it into a more appropriate spot in just a second. But you'll notice that we do need a username and password. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into my web browser. I'm going to close this. I'm going to go to database access. I'm going to add a new user. This user, I'm just going to call it YouTube. And the password is just going to be password1234. I realize that I'm giving my password out. We're going to make it expire automatically in just a second. But as far as the roles that I want, I probably don't want to give it a full access. So I'm going to give it specific privileges. I'm going to say add. I'm going to give this user read and write to the sample mflix database. And I'm going to give it access to the movies collection. So ideally, you would want to figure out what your user role should be. So generally, you don't want to give your user access to everything. But in this example, I know I'm only ever going to use the movies collection, so I'm just going to lock this user down to only have access to that collection. But you can actually specify what makes the most sense to you. Now, like I said, I exposed my username and password. I'm going to say that this is going to be a temporary user. It's going to expire after 6 hours. So by the time this video airs, the user will be deleted, and I won't have to remember to go back and delete it manually. So we have a user account. I can go back into my editor. I chose the username of YouTube, and the password was password1234. I'm going to save it. But one thing that you should note is that this is probably not a good idea to hard code your connection string directly in your function, because then you might be setting yourself up to exposure. It's not a good look. So what you can actually do is you can copy it. And instead what we're going to do is we're going to click on local settings.json, and we're going to create an environment variable field right here. So inside the values, doesn't really matter where, we're just going to create a new one. We're going to say MongoDB Atlas URI, and the naming convention really doesn't matter. This is more what you're going to remember yourself or what makes the most sense for your application needs. But I'm going to go ahead and paste it in. So I have the URI. I'm going to continue, and I'm going to add some more environment variables since I'm already here. I'm going to create another one. I'm going to say MongoDB Atlas cluster. I'm going to say that this is going to be examples because that's my cluster name. I'm going to say MongoDB Atlas database, and this particular database is called sample mflix. I'm going to say MongoDB Atlas collection, and this is going to be movies. Now, you can add other variables here if you want, but this actually represents our database or our MongoDB usage pretty well. So we have the URI, which we got from the MongoDB Atlas dashboard. We created a username and password. In my case, I set it to auto expire, and I only gave it access to the movies collection, which we're using. We're going to be using the sample mflix database, which is part of a sample data set, which I said earlier, you don't really need to use a sample data set. It really doesn't matter what you use for this example. And we're using the examples cluster. So I'm going to save it. I'm going to go back into my index.js file, and I'm going to erase this now. And we're going to make a modification here. So I'm actually going to use an environment variable. So I'm going to say process.env, and this is going to be MongoDB Atlas URI is, I believe, what we called it, and we can double check. So MongoDB Atlas URI. So that's how you use environment variables in Node.js, and it keeps it kind of outside of your function, and it's more secretive. All right, so we have the Mongo client. So we can actually start working on the function itself now. Now, we don't actually need what's inside of this function. It's a good boilerplate, but we can actually start fresh. So I erased everything that was inside, and this is where we can start adding our logic. So first of all, since we're using an async function, we're going to use async and await for a lot of this stuff because any connection to any third-party service, such as a database, is going to be asynchronous. So I'm going to say try, and I'm going to say catch. And if there was an error, what can we do? Well, we can respond with some kind of error. So we're going to say context.response res equals, and we're going to return an object here. So we're going to say the status is going to be, let's say, a 500 error, so some kind of internal server error. We're going to say headers. And for our headers, let's say that we want to return application JSON as the content type. So that way our client, whatever that may be, knows what to interpret here. So I'm going to say content type, and this is going to be application JSON. And I'm going to include a body. So this body is going to have a message. And we're going to say error dot, I don't know, toString. And that'll be what happens if there's any kind of error. So if this catch block triggers a error of any kind, that's what we'll get. All right, so inside the try block, what we can do is we can say constant. We can say, let's go ahead and get a reference to our database. And we're going to say await, because again, this is an asynchronous operation. We're going to say Mongo client. And we're going to say .db. And we're going to say process.env.mongodb atlas database. So let's go over a few things here so that way we have a clear understanding of what's going on. So line 3, we're not actually establishing a database connection. We're defining our Mongo client. And on line 8 here, when we get a reference to this database, we are establishing a connection. Now, if you've ever worked with functions before or serverless, you know that when a serverless function calls, you kind of don't want to establish a connection every time to your database, because then you're going to overload your database with concurrent connections. Doesn't matter if it's MongoDB, MySQL, or something else. Connections that are concurrent, they're finite. So you don't want to establish a connection on every function call. But MongoDB, since we're defining our client outside of the actual function, if the database already has a connection established, it's going to use it because we're still using that Mongo client. If the database connection has not been established, it will connect. So MongoDB is going to handle all of this for you, so you don't have to worry. So we have a reference to our database. Let's go ahead and get a reference to our collection now. So we're going to say constant collection equals database.collection. And once again, we're going to reference our environment variable. And once we have that collection environment variable, let's actually do some kind of interaction against the database. So we're going to say constant results equals await, and we're going to say collection dot find. And for the simplicity of this example, let's go ahead and just say that we're going to do an empty filter. So what we're saying here is we're going to return all documents that might exist in this particular collection, the movies collection. But since there's probably a lot of documents in this collection, I'm going to limit my result set to, say, 10. And I'm going to convert it to an array rather than working with a cursor. But a cursor may make more sense to you. It's totally up to you on what you choose to do. But I'm going to say to array. So it's going to convert all these maximum 10 records into an array, which we're then going to return back to the client. So let's go ahead and return that back to the client. Let's go ahead and say context.response, so res, equals, we're going to say headers, content type, we're going to say application./JSON, and we're going to say body, and we're going to say results, because we already have an array for the body, and it knows that we're using application JSON. So this, in theory, should work, and we can actually test this locally first. So we're going to worry about it locally, and then we're going to worry about sending it up to the Azure cloud. So locally, if I wanted to, in my terminal, I can say function start. We're going to see if there was any kind of errors, which I don't think there were. And it gave us a URL to access. So I'm going to open it in my browser. And you'll notice that it looks like we've got some results back. I'm thinking that this is probably 10 or less. I don't have a good way to look at it in this browser. But if I use another utility like Postman or something else, I could easily probably shrink these down and see exactly how many results came back. But it looks like my movies results came back as expected. So the connection locally was able to work without issues. Now we need to finalize a few things before we push it up to the Azure cloud. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into my Visual Studio Code. I'm going to go ahead and stop the local server. We don't need it anymore. So I stopped it. What I'm going to do is, well, I need to link this local application, so this local functions application, to my remote functions application that I created earlier in the tutorial with the Azure CLI. So right now they're not linked. They exist separately. So the first thing that I can do is inside of my terminal, this is within the Azure example directory, I'm going to say function. I'm going to say Azure function app fetch app settings. And I'm going to provide my function app name, which I believe was my MongoDB functions app. We can actually verify in our web browser. I'm going to go back to Azure. I'm going to go to function app. My MongoDB function app singular. All right, singular. So let's remove the S in there, and I'm going to hit enter. So it looks like it worked. So what it did is if I click on local.settings.json, it pulled down some information from my remote functions application. So it connected to Azure because I had already prior set up the CLI. It pulled some information down to help us connect the two together. I'm not done yet, though. I still need to fetch the storage settings as well. So remember, we created the storage location earlier in the tutorial, just like we created our function app. We will need it locally. So what I can say is I'm going to say function. I'm going to say Azure storage. And I'm going to say fetch connection string. And I'm going to provide the name of my storage location that we defined earlier, which was my MongoDB storage. And I'm going to hit enter. So you'll notice that inside of the local.settings.json file, now we have the storage information, just like we have the function app information. And this is in combination with the MongoDB Atlas information that we had added manually, not through a command line. So let's proceed and try to work towards getting this application deployed to the Azure cloud. So our local project and our remote project are in sync now. We know that the local project runs fine when we try to run it. We did our test. We went to the local URL. Everything seemed to check out. Now it's a matter of pushing it to the Azure cloud. But we have these custom variables. So we added these to our local project. They don't yet exist in our remote project. Now, there are two different ways that you can do this. You can either push them up from the command line, or you can go into your Azure dashboard for this particular project and add them manually. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add them manually. So I'm going to go into my web browser. I'm going to go home. I'm going to go to my Functions app. I'm going to click on it. I'm going to scroll down to Configuration. You'll notice a lot of this looks familiar. Remember, these are the variables that were just downloaded into our local application. We're going to go ahead and add some more variables. So I'm going to add a new application setting. This one is going to be MongoDB Atlas URI. And the value, I'm just going to copy it directly from our project. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go back into my web browser, and I'm going to paste it in. I'm going to say OK. I'm going to do the same thing for the other stuff as well. So I'm going to say add another one. I'm going to say MongoDB Atlas database. And this is going to be sample mflix. OK. I'm going to add another setting. I'm going to say MongoDB Atlas collection. This was movies. And while I didn't really make use of it, I didn't really need to add it. What I could do is I could add the cluster name, just in case you might need it in the future. So I'm going to say MongoDB Atlas cluster. And I believe that's what we called it. I'm going to go back into my Visual Studio Code. Yeah, MongoDB Atlas cluster. So this was examples. And I'm going to say OK. So we have all of our values added. What I can do is I can click Save. And we could have easily done this with the command line as well. But for video demonstration purposes, it was probably a little easier just to go into the web browser. All right, so it looks like everything was added successfully. Let's go back into our Visual Studio Code because we need to have access to the command line here. what we want to do is we want to run the following command. We want to say function Azure function app. We want to say publish, and we want to say my MongoDB function app, because that's the crazy name that we gave it, or at least the crazy name I gave it. And I'm going to hit enter. All right, so the application was pushed up to my Azure cloud application. It gave me a URL. I'm going to click on it, but you'll notice that it's going to probably error out here. So I'm going to open it. And you'll notice that the page is not working correctly right now. I got a 401 error. This is because we actually need to worry about our app key. So this is for our API, so we actually need to be able to use like an API token in order to access it. So let's go into the Microsoft Azure cloud here. For our application, we're going to go to app keys, and we're going to create a new host key. And I'm going to just call this one, I don't know, example key. And we're going to say, okay, we're going to let it auto-generate. So it created us this example key. I can actually click the hidden value and I'm going to copy it. I'll have deleted this before this video airs, so you won't be able to use it. All right, so now that we have that app key, we can actually make use of it. So go ahead and copy it. We can go into that URL that failed previously because of the 401 authorization problems. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say in the URL bar, I'm going to say question mark code equals, and I'm going to paste it in, and I'm going to hit enter. Now you have to remember that this is just a query param that I added for the app key. You can easily add this with Postman or curl. I believe you can actually use header information as well for this as well. There are other ways to authenticate with a Microsoft Azure function app. This is just the most basic that we went over. But as you can see, it seemed to have worked. So we were able to test this both locally and remotely. So I want to go over a few things just to kind of rehash everything that we accomplished today, because we actually did quite a bit, and it was a mix of the command line as well as point and click. But within MongoDB, what we did was we saw MongoDB Atlas. We saw our collections. In this case, this was a sample database called mflix, which is kind of like a Netflix or IMDb. We saw the movies collection. We created a database user for that, so YouTube, which is going to expire on us automatically. As far as Microsoft Azure goes, so we created a new function app, and that included a new group, a new storage location, all of which we decided to use the US East, so East US. There are other regions that you can use as well. But we went ahead and created that. Inside of our command line, what we did outside of actually creating the group and things like that is we created a new functions project and a new function inside of it. So that function was just a get movies function. It returned everything but limited it to 10 results. We were able to use the connection information from MongoDB that existed inside of our local settings, which we kind of synchronized with what existed remotely for Azure. So we got the remote function information for our project as well as the storage information. We tested it locally, seemed to work out fine, and then we pushed it remotely after we had input our environment variables that we had created ourselves. So we pushed those up. When we pushed up the application, we did have to create an app key, so that way we can access it without a 401 error. But when we provided that with our request, everything seemed to work out correctly. So this was a good introduction to working with Microsoft Azure Functions, with Node.js, and using them to interact with MongoDB. So MongoDB is a absolutely awesome option when it comes to working with serverless. In my example, I did use a M0 cluster, like I had mentioned earlier. You may want to consider evaluating the serverless instances, so that way not only do you have a serverless function, but you have a serverless database as well. It could be very valuable to you in this scenario. It's totally up to you. It depends on your application needs. If you like this video, please take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, drop me a comment if you got stuck somewhere. I'd be happy to help you out. Until next time, hope everyone has a great rest of your day.